Okay, this is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek and Pacifica, and today I'm talking about a book and an author, Manny Ness, who is the author of Migration as Economic Imperialism. Welcome to the show, Manny.
It's a pleasure to be with you again, Steve, as usual.
And you're a professor at CUNY and also a head of the International Committee at CUNY.
Yes, I am,
Okay.
Chair. And we passed a resolution that supports BDS. Yeah.
Why did you decide to write this book, Migration as Economic Imperialism?
I wrote the book, Migration as Economic Imperialism, because at the core, the establishment, and by that I mean liberals, their position is one in which is unreal. It's not palatable. Um, they praise migrants, as I do, for their hard work. They support improving their conditions, which I do as well. I've been engaged in a lot of campaigns over the years around immigrant worker rights. But what they don't get is that immigrants are being exploited. And so there's a segment of the population of capital that wants more migrants. That's the high tech industry, and actually the United States itself wants undocumented immigrants because they're exploitable. So you can be exploited if you're not willing to be exploited. You're arrested, uh, detained, and deported. So there's a full policy of this. I wrote the book because this is a critical moment in history where we have somewhere near 200 million migrants who are going from one country to another, what I would say international migrants. And we have somewhere near 800 million internal migrants. So, there are about a billion migrants. That's, that's a 1/8 of humanity. And then if you consider their families, it's probably about half of humanity. So it's a crucial issue. And what I'm trying to focus on is the issue of unequal exchange. The fact that workers in the global south are highly exploited, workers in the third world. I'm going to go back to using that terminology because I think it's appropriate. And uh, and they're ready to work in other places because they may get paid a little more wages, but they're highly exploited. And this form of exploitation goes beyond the economic exploitation, such as wage theft and so forth, but it goes to exploiting women. And it really breaks up families in ways that are, permanent and so forth. So it has a comprehensive uh, uh, deleterious effect on on migrants and their families and the countries from which they come. So if we say that 80% of the population is poor in the world from the global south, well, then the idea is for them to migrate. So I'm going against the mainstream liberal argument, but I think more and more people are taking on this approach.
Thanks. Well, one of the issues, before we get into your book, I mean, one of the issues that needs to be addressed is the whole question of imperialist wars. We have the greatest migration since the Second World War. The invasion of Iraq led to millions of people escaping Iraq. The attack on Libya, the attack on Syria has led to mass migration as a result of imperialist war, U.S. intervention, and other imperialist intervention in Africa. This migration, it came from someplace. And of course, there's a rise of fascism blaming the immigrants. So the issue of migration and isn't this migration in large part caused by imperialist war of U.S. imperialism?
Yes, there was the old phrase, and I think we all remember it, is that we're here because you were there. In other words, you invaded us, so we are here. You ruined our lives and destroyed our communities and states. So we're here in the United States or Western Europe. And so, yes, you're absolutely correct with the question of the rise of fascism. And migration is actually the most significant issue with respect to fascism because all the candidates who are running for office, not just in the United States, but in Europe and other rich countries, are blaming immigrants for taking away jobs, which is absolutely not true. In fact, the United States probably could not even survive without immigrants, documented and undocumented, um, because there's a shortage of labor. There are tight labor markets and so forth, as we saw in the report yesterday. So, we see the rise of neo-Nazi and Nazi parties in countries such as Germany, again, which is very, very disturbing. There's a party called the Homeland Party, which is to the right of the Alternative for Germany, AfD. So we're seeing this happening in a broad way. I would add, I know you may disagree with me, this is also true in Ukraine, but if I don't think most people in Ukraine are fascists by any means,
Well, I mean,
but
migration.
people around the country are.
Yeah, but
That's right.
as far as Ukraine, the breakup of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Soviet Union led to mass migration in Eastern Europe, other countries outside of those countries to, so a large number of Ukrainians, Moldovians, all kinds of Eastern Europeans have ended up in the rest of Europe. But I want to
Right.
get into one of the issues that you in your book talk about, and that is COVID-19, the effect on migration. I know that we had the situation of sailors, many of them Filipino, who were locked on ships during the COVID crisis. And of course, Philippines is the first colony, one of the first colonies of the United States when we invaded in 1889, took over the country to bring democracy. Millions were killed. They used waterboarding. U.S. troops used waterboarding in the Philippines. That's where it was first used. And the the effect of COVID has exacerbated the crisis of migrants. Why don't you talk about COVID and how COVID figures into migration and the conditions of migrant workers?
Okay, and we're talking about migrants in the rich countries primarily, but also in other countries that are moderate income. Again, I'll say they're essential workers. It's the migrant workers in this country are the ones that will be driving your ambulance to the hospital when you have COVID-19 extreme symptoms. They're the people who will treat you in the hospital, who will be engaged in all forms of work in the hospital and are essential workers in public health and so forth. Of course, many of them get paid very low wages and so forth. The irony of this is that here we have essential workers who are, they're the most despised in this country, or there's a high level of xenophobia that is directed against them when in fact Americans are the beneficiaries of them. So with respect to COVID, again, I talked about wage theft, and we know that there's been a lot of literature on the subject of wage theft, but that has become rampant because many migrants who have been living in different parts of the world had to go back home. They're forced to go back. And as a consequence, they were not paid their wages and they came back highly indebted because, people think that migrants who reached the United States or Europe or some other place didn't pay to come here, but they paid dearly to come here. Families saved up money. They also risked their lives to cross borders and so forth. And, they were the people who delivered your food or your goods to your door, delivery workers. They're all migrants, or 90% of them are migrant workers. So, and they did that during COVID-19 when people were afraid to go outside or didn't want to go outside because of fear of infection and so forth. So, it's been used as a means to first exploit workers who are essential to the economy, essential to public health, as well as many other sectors of the economy, food distribution and so forth. And at the same time, here you have a population that is targeted by the right wing in this country. You mentioned the term fascist. Yeah, I agree. It's directed against them mainly, almost exclusively.
And of course, the multinationals and tech companies have benefited from migrant labor. Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, a large number of those workers are migrant workers. And the issue of wage theft, I mean, there's billions of dollars in this country. Amazon, many companies, multinational companies. Why don't you talk about the role of the multinationals, international capital in the exploitation of migrant labor, how they profit from it?
Well, absolutely, you're right. The migrants are the workers who are employed at Uber. Oh, well, they're not employed, right? According to
They're
California state.
independent operators. But
Lyft
they're
and
operating under the direction of Uber, it's
yes, of course, and DoorDash, et cetera. Uber Eats. We have Grubhub here in New York City, et cetera, et cetera. You probably have it there too. And so, there's a high level of exploitation there. On a global level, with respect to companies such as Uber and Amazon, the big tech companies, they don't, these companies don't only operate in the United States, they operate internationally. In fact, for a time, Uber was operating in China, and I still think they have a stake in their major ride hailing company called Didi, which is a huge company. They basically take, yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, they do undermine wages amongst taxi drivers. They create a situation in which um, workers have to work 18 hours a day in order to survive. Um, they put nothing into it except for the platform. So everyone has their phone, their smartphone, and they have their car that they buy on their own. And that happens in the United States, but on a global level, this is happening throughout the world, not just in rich countries, but also middle and poor countries who have a proliferation of these kinds of drivers, ride hailing, delivering, um, uh, care workers. One could say women are one of the most significant forms of migrant workers, and many of them are on the platform, um, uh, getting one job to the next through their smartphone in places like Europe and the United States and so forth. So, yeah, these companies, you mentioned Amazon, there's a lot of dissent amongst workers in Amazon. Uh, you could you could see it on a daily basis. We had the organization of Amazon workers here in Staten Island, which demonstrated the sentiment that workers had for a strong union to represent them. Yet at the same time, Amazon is so enormous. What is it, a trillion plus company, maybe 2 trillion around there, that they could basically destroy any union they want to.
Well,
That's the
actually, Amazon, like other companies, are able to get away with flagrant violations of the labor law, like Tesla, because there's no enforcement. And the Democrats who run California and New York, for example, allow this. There's workers' comp fraud against injured workers. But the reality is, and you mentioned in your book that some unions have made an effort to organize migrant workers, but by and large, that's been unsuccessful. And actually, wouldn't it require a radical and revolutionary approach to organizing workers? I mean, for example, in the 30s, the way GM and Chrysler were organized as occupations and thousands of workers surrounding these factories. That's how they forced these companies, which did not want to have unions, to recognize the union. And similar action, if the unions are going to organize these large number of migrant workers who are at Amazon, actually, would require that kind of mass action, challenging the government, the state, and the corporations.
that's true. I mean, the major industrial union movement in the United States was made up of migrants from Eastern and Southern Europe in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s.
The
Uh,
8 hour day was
yeah,
immigrant workers. The fight for the
yeah,
8 hour
right.
day in Chicago.
That's the United States and virtually any other settler colonial state that had migrants. You're absolutely right that migrants comprised a very significant factor in the mobilization and the creation of the so-called I don't like the term so-called, but the self-described, I think that's better to say, labor movement, because I have problems with the Solidarity Center and so forth. That's another subject for another day.
Well,
Uh,
actually, the developments in the Teamsters Union. I know that the Teamsters this will be inviting Trump to their Teamster offices. In fact, O'Brien ordered the executive board to come and attend and listen to Trump, which is
yeah,
causing some opposition. But I mean, I know Fitzsimmons, who was the past president of the Teamsters, was uh, said that he was concerned about migrants coming from Latin America, Central and Latin America, because they would bring communism, they would bring socialist ideas,
yeah.
that kind of racist ideology, and the. Do you think that the terrorism against immigrants by the right wing and accepted by the Democratic Party? The problem is the migrants, not the United States intervening in Central America and Latin America with coups and revolutions and supporting military dictatorships. That actually is a direct result of imperialism.
Yes, yes, and that's the point of the book that migration as an economic imperialism, that workers are highly exploited. And as you pointed out, the immigrants who came here during the height of the U.S. labor movement in the early to mid 20th century were from Europe, and the entire families came. Those people who come now are considered to be undocumented. I don't use the other term. So they don't have any rights whatsoever. And I think there's a tendency amongst the migration scholar industry to say that they're doing well because they form their own hometown communities and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that that's not true. I mean, these people represent the poorest segment of the population in the United States, except for those people who are, in prison or, living, out of their cars, etc. But we're looking at a very, very impoverished segment of the population that is also subjected to racism. So now there's a large number of Venezuelans coming to the United States, and these are Venezuelans who are actually progressive. I would say these are the Venezuelans who supported Chavez, um, but they can't survive there because the United States applied sanctions on Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian government there. And so, as a consequence, this round of migrants from Venezuela are mistreated in this country.
Well,
And
it's
despite,
interesting that the Democrats, there's no campaign among the Democrats to end the sanctions on
no,
all these countries, yet the sanctions are driving people in these other countries to the United States. I mean, it's a bit of duplicity and hypocrisy for the Democrats to talk about immigration when they don't mention the cause of the immigration, in part, is the fact that the United States is squeezing these other countries, driving people out from these other countries.
absolutely. I mean, that's absolutely true. I mean, in the case of Venezuela now is the correct, so and Democrats are the leaders behind it. It's not actually Republicans do it too. So, you've got a two-headed party, but party state, I'll call it, if you may. They use that term toward other countries. So we have a party state in this country which demonizes any country that seeks to have some kind of democratic and socialist program. And as a consequence of that, through nationalization of the economy and that are crucial segments that are crucial to the industry, the United States in turn applies sanctions on those countries. And as a consequence of that, these countries can't sell their oil, for instance, or they can't sell their manufactured goods and beyond. So these countries become impoverished as a consequence. And so now we're seeing then, we shouldn't blame the migrants. The migrants are actually here and they're helping Americans in significant ways. Just think about the aging of the U.S. population and who's taking care of that population. And
And
so,
that's true. That's true for all the advanced countries. Japan,
yeah,
aging population, Europe, they need migrants, they need immigrant workers to take care of people with a declining population, including in now you have a situation in China with
yes,
the age and the problem of the seniors in these countries. One of the issues that I wanted you to talk about is this national industrial development, because this forced migration or migration because of wars or economic crisis leads to skilled people leaving these countries. I know in Costa Rica, you have companies, big tech companies, that Microsoft, Facebook, that hire the best engineers, and then they only have a short-term contract, so they lose their jobs and they have to leave and come to the United States, or have to leave their country. So you have a drain of skilled workers, highly skilled workers in other countries. So doesn't that actually inhibit the industrial development of these other countries?
Yes, it does in a significant way. I mean, that's a central point. They used to call it the brain drain, then the brain gain, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in effect, migration does nothing to help those countries of origin except for the families. So I think the best example would be India. You got nothing against, we should support all immigrants in this country, irrespective of where they come from and so forth. But the Indians who are able to come into this country, they don't have to pay for passports, flights, etc. They get to come if they're in the IT industry or the STEM industries and end up in places like Silicon Valley. They get carte blanche to have very wealthy jobs. Of course, they're not taking jobs away. They're just a segment of the Indian population that is extremely wealthy, that are
And
able to
aren't
send their students to elite universities who come here.
but a lot of them are indentured servants. They have to work for one company or they lose their visa
Yeah,
status. I mean, that's a whole
that's true.
situation. I mean, they come here and I actually some unions, the United Farm Workers and uh the others is in Mexico saying you can come for Mexican agricultural workers, but you have to work for one company. It's the immigration program for agricultural workers. So it's kind of an indentured servant situation for workers coming to this country from Mexico and other
Yeah, but
countries.
there's a real difference between workers with high skills who are privileged who come to this country and workers who come to this country who are undocumented. And they just a fundamental difference. Yet at the same time, you're right. If you switch jobs, you face deportation.
And this economic imperialism, I mean, one of the issues is the export. I mean, United States and multinationals want the export of resources, natural resources, chemicals, lithium, and other resources. They really don't want to develop these countries as competitors. And isn't that how they see these other countries? If they develop their industrial uh, uh, production, that would be a threat to domination of US multinationals and European multinationals.
So you're saying that the mining of let's say lithium, which is for electric vehicles and so forth, uh, contributes to migration, or I'm
Well, no,
just
the what I think what the multinationals want is raw materials.
yeah.
Like in Namibia now, Namibia, the government there's a lot of anger because of unemployment and the export of lithium, uranium, and what the government has just recently said is they're demanding the lithium be processed in Namibia before it's shipped out. So I mean,
Oh
but
yeah,
so
I see.
their jobs for the Namibians processing their natural resources. But I think what the multinationals want and the capitalists want is they just want the raw product and they'll process it someplace else. That's
You're absolutely correct in that point. Namibia is one of the countries that's highly exploited by South Africa, but also by Western countries as well. But one could say that, just pick a country like Ghana, which produces quote unquote uh, tens of thousands of nurses. Ghana is a country of what, 20 million or so, is on the smaller level in Africa, but that's a pretty big population. They need nurses, but those nurses get shipped out to Britain. And as a consequence, there's a shortage of nurses in poor countries like Ghana. So it's a really unfortunate situation, and we can say that's a form of economic imperialism without any question about it. I also want to say that I challenge these liberal and mainstream migration scholars just on that specific point. They say, well, migration is rich to rich country, or it's only the rich countries from which people migrate. But the vast majority of migrants come from poor countries and are poor people. And I'll make the other point that where they're right is that most of the money goes to rich migrant workers. And those migrant workers have the opportunity to become permanent residents in the United States or even citizens. However, there's a rise of what is called temporary workers throughout the world who are also documented, but if they switch jobs, they lose that documentation status. And I can say a lot about that. But so I'm just going to say there is a bifurcation. There's a class difference amongst the migrants themselves, but the vast majority are poor. There's a small number of doctors or STEM workers and so forth, just to say it into a whole. But I completely agree with you with respect to Africa. It's being it's the recolonization of Africa, and they do not get to refine or develop their industries. So, for instance, cocoa that's produced in Cote d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast is manufactured in Switzerland, as chocolate. And one can go on and on. Cobalt and other rare materials, coltan, that are produced in the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, are sent to China, where you have actually they're produced by kids who are working, 12 to 18 years old, who are working in under really under the barrel of the gun at very low wages. That gets sent to China, where workers are paid very low wages to produce our iPhones and smartphones and so forth and so on. And then they sell it to where they can make the most money, which is the United States and Europe. That's where the consumers are, where they can sell those products. Of
Yeah, I
course,
agree with you about this recolonization of Africa, but if you look at Namibia, the largest investor in Namibia is China. They've taken over the uranium mines, they've taken over the marble mines, all of the marble mines, all the uranium mines, and they're the largest road construction company. They actually export labor from China to Namibia to build the roads and to do a lot of the production. And in fact, the lithium mines, the government had a big pile of lithium that they stopped going onto a ship to China, and they demanded that it be processed in Namibia uh, instead of being just shipped as a raw material to China. But the other aspect I wanted to talk.
that's true. That it is true that there is a propensity for Chinese workers to end up doing the work in the countries of destination.
And that's very
Like
harmful. That's very harmful. I mean, you have a high unemployment in Africa already, and to have workers brought in from China to do that
yeah,
work.
we had a discussion about it. It's very that is true. Yeah.
And one of
Yes.
the issues I also want to address is you have migration leaving countries, but also you have internal migration. I know the largest in the world was in China with the workers, rural areas who came in to build the cities, 260 million building. They really were the core of the industrial development of China, the new cities and that kind of thing. And yet they have second class situation. They have to go back to their rural areas to get schooling, and they're actually in a very bad situation because they don't have the same rights as other Chinese workers who are born like in Beijing or Guangzhou or
That's you're talking about the Hoku system.
yeah, the
That's
migration of
changing. That's changing. There has been the organization. I mean, where is the labor organization taking place? It's in China. To a far larger level than anywhere else, and it's in fact supported by the state. They tend to go to state-owned enterprises, and yes, there's still Hoku systems that are in place in China, but it's been uh, in decline over the last few decades. But yes, internal migration is also part of migration as economic imperialism, because you have workers who are living in the countryside. I prefer to use a country, India, where there's far more exploitation, where workers make far lower wages than China. They barely make enough to survive themselves. So for instance, if you go to a location like a steel producing center in Delhi called Wazirapur, there are migrant workers, almost exclusively migrant workers, who are living in ramshackle buildings and so forth, where you have open air steel mills, hundreds of them. And so if somebody's killed in the process through, very easily can be killed in a steel company like that because they have no protection whatsoever when cold rolled steel just shoots through somebody's body, which happens on a daily basis there in just in that neighborhood. And so they go to the morgue and the cops come and investigate it. It gets filed, and the family is so far away that they can't really litigate the case. But so if the family is lucky, they'll get what, $100 for it. So the lives are cheap, in that context. And they are actually producing steel for the United States there. So when you go to Indian restaurant, take a look at the bottom of the steel plates you get. It'll say made in India.
And one
That's
of the issues is, of course, we're in a capitalist world, and the division of labor is within a capitalist world is where they can make the most profit. So they'll export, work that can be done to increase their profits. But the question of capital investment, uh, United States, Europe, and the imperialist countries are, of course, want to make the greatest profits. And if that's outsourcing, as it was in the United States, to the South, first to the South, then to Latin America, Mexico, and then to China, that's where they'll do. In relationship to that structure, that capitalist economic structure internationally, you also have BRICS. So is BRICS any different from investment and how they make their investment? Because obviously, U.S. multinationals and European multinationals have a perspective towards just increasing their profit, not developing these countries industrially.
Yeah, so I just want to start out that, the key point that Lenin says in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, is that the crucible of imperialism is finance capital, right? So in that context, workers are exploited uh, to a high degree, and there's a form of parasitism that develops as a consequence of that, in which the uh, foreign countries basically take over the entire industries of those states. And I think we should not forget Lenin's important work, which has been, I think, has had a resurgence. With respect to the BRICS, I really don't know much about the topic. I think they're changing. Of course, if they're changing, they've enlarged and so forth. I think the future remains to be seen. But, of course, like you said earlier, uh, there, I mean, I think it's more complex. I don't really have, Russia is certainly a capitalist country. I'll say that without
And
question.
Saudi Arabia,
India, so of course, yeah, these are capitalist
I mean,
countries.
they're in BRICS. So the question is, are you going to have a different framework for development, economic and social development, when you have imperialist countries or want to be imperialist countries who are exporting capital? I mean, Saudi Arabia is investing massive amounts of capital all over the world in the United States and other countries. Yeah.
Yeah, they're exporting capital, and a lot of it to the United States. Well, but that gets saved in dollars. But yeah, there's a lot of export of capital, and that export of capital contributes to the exploitation of workers. Uh, so ironically, actually, there's a smaller degree of export of capital to poor countries who make up 80% of the world than to rich countries. That's something that people don't know. And that just shows you how productive and how much money these multinational corporations make as a consequence of even small investments in these countries.
And lastly, I mean, the question of migrant workers globally. I think I heard 300 million migrant workers. The numbers, especially, have increased as a result of
It's close to just 240 million
140. Okay,
migrants, but
but
100. Yeah, go ahead.
it's actually increased as a result of these wars U.S. wars and have forced migration of tens of millions of workers. Do you see any organizing internationally of migrant workers where they can come together internationally? Very difficult. I know women have organized, Filipino uh, workers home. I did this video actually on a protest at the Gap
Uh,
in San Francisco of women from Bangladesh demanding, protection, health and safety protection for garment workers in Bangladesh who were burned in their factories. They were locking the doors
oh, yes.
of the
Yeah.
factories, which and interestingly enough, the largest number of hits, guess where they were coming from for this video on Bangladesh uh, factories, the conditions of Bangladesh workers at the Gap. Well, the largest number of hits were coming from Saudi Arabia.
Interesting. Why is that the case?
The women that were forced to go to Saudi Arabia to work.
Oh, okay, okay, that makes sense. And they have the a specific system in which workers are highly exploited, especially women, uh, because they expropriate people's passports. Many of the workers in the Gulf states are subjected to um, isolation and so
Slave
forth.
labor conditions where you're beaten, you're sexually harassed, raped, and you're stuck in these homes in very terrible conditions. So
That happens in a lot, in some cases, yeah. I would agree there. I mean, if you take a look at the population of one of the BRICS countries, the United Arab Emirates, well, if you, the number of the population of people living there is over 13 million. Uh, do you know what the population of the country of citizens, the citizens,
60,000,
uh, yeah, it's about 2 million to 3 million.
2
So it
million.
just
Yeah,
shows
that's
you,
right.
and some of the other countries are, like Qatar is even more disparate in terms of the number of people there and the population that live there.
I mean, that would be an example of economic imperialism, where you have a country where they bring in these workers who have second-class workers. They don't have no rights, and yet they're the majority of workers in these countries.
Yes, and the one thing about this process that we can't forget is in the cases of people who migrate to the, let's say, the Arab Gulf states and to Southeast Asia, uh, that region, Asia as a whole, people are temporary migrants. So they have to go back no matter what. No, an undocumented worker in the United States is not necessarily temporary, right? I mean, they may stay here for their whole lives and may have a family here and so forth. But these workers are forced to go home. They're really sad stories. If I've, interviewed a lot of people and have seen a lot of examples of children that have been away from their families, their parents, and so forth, and are uh, completely isolated and home. I mean, the parents are homesick and so forth, and want to see their kids, and so it really breaks up families to some degree. But with respect to temporary migration, people are forced to go back. Period. And otherwise, they're undocumented and they're arrested and deported.
And it is capitalism on a global level. And I think what you say in your book basically is the migration and the exploitation of migrants is an example of how capitalism operates on a global level.
Yes, I completely agree that capitalism is run by the imperialist states. Without my perspective is that, um, and this is also Lenin's, that imperialism allows capital to become profitable, and without imperialism, capital will not be as profitable. So it is capital, yeah, it's capital writ
So
large.
fighting for migrants and immigrant workers is
Imperialist capital.
fighting
That's what.
against capitalism in this country because the capitalists profit off
Yeah,
of illegal immigration, illegal workers,
undocumented. Yeah.
undocumented. Yeah.
But yeah, completely true. And yes, People, that's the irony of this whole issue with respect to, let's say, the United States, which people here probably, your listeners know the best, that it is undocumented workers themselves um, who are benefiting the United States in terms of its economy. Virtually every sector of the economy benefits from it. And so I'll just state the five key sectors of any economy would be agriculture, construction, manufacturing, care work, services, et cetera, as well as the platform economy. And these are the sectors that migrant workers go into, as well as the STEM sectors. But so the United States is a net beneficiary of migration, and actually, it's the Democratic and Republican parties, the corporate parties segment that would like to see more migration, legal migration that would allow people to be exploited on a far larger scale. But that's because of populism, right-wing populism. We're finding many people like Donald Trump and his ilk saying, well, the migrants are our enemies and so forth. So since 1986, under, ironically, Reagan, there hasn't been any immigration law in the United States. So we're, almost 40 years out from getting a migrant. It's just outrageous if you think about it. Whereas other countries do have migration laws. So I argue, and I think it's very important, the absence of a migration regime is a migration regime. In other words, if you say everybody's undocumented, that's what your policy is.
And you can exploit and make more profit from it.
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us. We've been talking with Immanuel Ness. He's a professor, CUNY College, and he's written a book called Migration as Economic Imperialism. Thanks for joining us.